see how that goes.
Okay, noted, thanks.
Thank you.
You want to have Mario the first slide already on? Oh.
Yes, I will start.
So good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. It's 11 o'clock Central European time, but as I said, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining from. Very much welcome to this webinar on integrating climate risk in the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. We are going to have a 90-minute session with all of you. Thanks very much for joining us today. We promise you it's going to be a very interesting session. I would like to start perhaps with some house rules that we're going to observe during this webinar. First of all, you may notice that there is interpretation available for this webinar, so you may choose whether you want to stay in the English or the French channel. You see that French interpretation is available, and what you need to do is to click on the interpretation button that you will find on the lower side of your screen, and then there is where you can choose between English or French. So if you can keep your video on, that will also help us. And we are looking for a very interactive session, and we invite you to put your questions and your comments in the chat box. We are going to do the best to keep an eye on the chat box and try to answer questions as we go. What we would like you is if you can please name yourselves using the chat box, having the name first and then the organization. To do this, you have to click on participants to open the participant window, and then you go to your name, you select more, and then you select rename, and then you can change your name. So this way we will see all of you as participants, we will see your name, and we will see the organization that that you are being joining from. Just lastly, to say that this session, as we speak, is being recorded, and hopefully that's fine with all of you, but we need to make you aware that the session is going to be recorded all along. Next slide, please. Actually, before this slide, sorry, Mario, we wanted to launch a quick poll just to see, colleagues, which parts of the world you are joining from. So, Mario, whenever you are ready, if we can have this slide with a little poll for you colleagues to tell us where you are joining from. So if you go to the, I believe, yeah, going to see a map of the world. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Mario. So we have colleagues, you can use the chat box. In the chat box, you see that there is a link, and then you can use that link to let us know the places where you're joining from. So we see for the moment different places in pan-European continent and also in Asia. And we have some colleagues also telling us in the chat box joining from Nepal. Can just give a couple of more seconds as we see that the map is getting populated, and we see some colleagues also from the Africa continent. This is very interesting. More colleagues joining from Asia, Uzbekistan, Nepal. We have different colleagues joining from Nepal, different places across Europe. We believe it's very early still in the Americas for colleagues to be joining from there. The thing is that the session is going to be recorded. We have also colleagues from GWP and CB joining from Denmark and Armenia. Perfect. Oh, so we actually have somebody joining from the Caribbean part of the world. So welcome. It's going to be early for sure. Thanks very much, Mario. I think this gives us an idea that this is a truly global webinar. We have participants from, we could say, almost all the continents. So this is great. It's going to be a great discussion. What I wanted to do right now is just to quickly introduce the webinar objectives. And then, colleagues, what we want to do is we want to introduce the National Adaptation Plan formulation process and how the water and the more specific water sanitation and hygiene sector is integrated into the National Adaptation Plans. We are going to also share some thoughts on some slides, indeed, to introduce the strategic framework for climate resilient water sanitation and hygiene. And we will see how a risk analysis has been applied recently in Bolivia. We will see this as a quick case study. We are also going to have some experience sharing between countries on how water and water sanitation and hygiene is integrated in the National Adaptation Plan process. So next slide, please, Mario. The agenda is, as we said, we have 90 minutes scheduled. We're running now the first part of this session. By the way, my name is Jose Gesti. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm working as a water and climate senior advisor with the Global Water Partnership. I'm a consultant working on these issues. I'm doing this role of moderator today. And after this short introduction, we will have welcome remarks by UNDP. Rohini Kohi is with us today. Okay. Then we will have a presentation by Kidane from colleague in GWP. I will speak on the water sanitation and hygiene strategic framework, and I will go over the case study for Bolivia. And then we will have UNDP and regional colleagues sharing some country experience in Togo about the articulation of the climate rationale for water sanitation and hygiene investments as it relates to an ongoing Green Climate Fund project proposal that is being developed. So Benjamin from UNDP will be walking us through that part of this session. Then we have a facilitated discussion with some polls, and we have Sadia consulting with UNDP, and we have Kidane and myself will navigate this part as well. And then finally, we will invite Rohini to do a summary, the most difficult part, which is going to be for Rohini to summarize a couple of key points coming from this session. So that's the way we have structured this. And I think without further ado, I'm happy that we are perfectly on time. I would like to hand over now to Rohini. Rohini is a lead technical specialist for the National Adaptation Plan Global Support Program at UNDP. And Rohini is going to give us some welcoming remarks and talk a little bit more about this program. So I hand over to you now, Rohini. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. And also from our side, a very, very warm welcome to everyone for this webinar on integrating climate risks into the water sector.
Next slide, please.
I am, as Jose mentioned, my name is Rohini Kohli. I am the team leader for the UNDP NAP Global Support Program, which is a joint UNDP UNEP program. And Global Water Partnership is a very key partner of this program. At the moment, as part of the work we are doing under the Global Support Program, is there is a focus on support to quite a lot of LDCs, least developed countries. And as of last year, one of the areas of support is really to help some countries that have requested to formulate their first national adaptation plans. And these include countries such as Burundi, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo DRC, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, and Timor-Leste, to frame their first NAPs, based on existing information. In addition, we are working with over 30 countries across the world on developing their national adaptation plan process through the GCF readiness resources. And in many cases, they will be resulting in a more comprehensive national adaptation plan based on, improved risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, and prioritization. And this formulation and the implementation support is something that is a full contribution also to the NDC process that is taking place. UNDP has an initiative called the Climate Promise, where we support over 100 countries to enhance their NDCs upon their request, and of which a significant proportion are LDCs. So to get back to the NAP's Global Support Program, this is the last phase of the program, and webinars such as this one are a South-South exchange, on not just South-South, but also North-South, and general exchange of experiences between countries and practitioners, and anyone that is really interested in adaptation planning process, and that is engaged in this. So, and also a bit about the collaboration with the Global Water Partnership. We're very pleased to have this collaboration. We have been working with them also on a training package in the past on integrating climate risks into the water sector, but also integrating water issues in the national NAP process as well. So there are two dimensions of it. I think right now this is a very important topic to discuss because we are in the middle of a pandemic. And I think COVID-19 is highlighting the need to relentlessly continue to advance and scale up adaptation and resilience. And a lot of discussion is happening about how to recover from this pandemic and in some cases build back better. And there's a huge linkage to the adaptation work under this. And issues such as clean water, are linked to health, nutrition, education, learning, but also, productive uses of water, irrigation. There are health dimensions to it. There are agriculture dimensions. There are many dimensions to the issue of water resources, and we can't cover all of them today. But this is clearly a very central issue for the NAPS process. To remind ourselves about the NAPS process, it sort of has been an agreement between the Conference of Parties for a long time. It has not moved as fast as it should have, but it's established by the COP and is recognized in the Paris Agreement. And it is not seen as a one-off plan. It is seen as a process. So there may be a series of plans because as the science improves, as the practice improves, and the learning improves, the adaptation plans will become more sophisticated. And some of the key areas are to identify prioritization and prioritize adaptation options and implement these options. And also to do an analysis over the long term of current and future climate change and assessment of the risks and vulnerabilities of each country. Several countries in the NAP process are working on water issues. I think we'll hear one or two examples today, but we also know in Asia, for example, for countries like Bhutan, the issue of water is a very key center point of the NAP process, and it's one of the very big priority sectors. But today we'll hear from examples from Zambia, Togo, and Bolivia. And this is also an extension of the South-South exchange we just did with LDCs, where we had about 30 LDCs and 6 non-LDCs that exchanged over 5 days in the end of June on different sectoral topics. So I think it's a really good opportunity to have an exchange today. And we look forward to some engagement. So hopefully we can use the chat box for a lot of Q&A. And we encourage you to engage with the speakers, but also amongst yourselves. And let me just close again by thanking everyone who has joined us very warmly and have taken the time for the conversation. And let me now hand to Jose, back to Jose for the next segment. Back to you, Jose.
Thank you very much, Rohini. That was really good to hear, and I echo. I mean, from the sector, we are aware that the national adaptation planning process needs to speed up, right? The commitments, the initial commitments that were made are long due, and by 2020 we were expecting to have many more national adaptation plans already in place, especially. I think it's great to see all the work that you're doing specifically with LDCs, as there are so few less developed countries that have already put forward their national adaptation plans. I really like when you say about the embedding the risk assessments, right, and understanding risk as a core part of formulating a national adaptation plan. But I also really like when you said that national adaptation plans will become more sophisticated. I really like that. I think we are learning as we go as well, and that the emphasis that you want to see as well is on appraising the right options. And how can you appraise the right options if you haven't gone before and done a thorough risk analysis, right? You need to understand the risk first, so to be able to appraise the right options. I think the next presentation this is really giving us the floor, Rohini, and thank you so much for what comes after, because we are going to indeed continue sharing more examples on how this can be done. What I would like to do now is to continue with our session, to invite our colleague, Kidane. Kidane is a technical advisor in the Global Water Partnerships Africa region, right, Kidane? And you have already a very interesting presentation on how water is a key component of the national adaptation planning process in Zambia. So I have over to you, Kidane.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Rohini, for that important remarks opening. So what I will do is I will just share with you how water is being integrated in the National Adaptation Plan NAP process by considering the Zambian case. Joseph was supposed to also join us, so I will be kind of a joint presentation. Next slide, please. So this one is trying to understand how is water linked to climate change adaptation. As you may know, there is, for example, like a climate hazard, for example. So the climate risk, Jose, you're going to talk about, is a result of the interaction between a hazard and the vulnerability and exposure. So if you build your capacity to adapt, then you'll have a chance to actually minimize the risk. So we wanted to recognize the adaptation actions are very important by way of reducing vulnerability of the climate change impacts, but also you build also your capacity, adaptive capacity, so that you reduce and build actually your resilience to climate change. So and we find water as a key factor in building climate resilience and as part of important component of climate change adaptation. So I don't want to go into the very much details, but trying to understand the conceptual understanding how climate risk is composed of. It's a result of the three aspects. There is a hazard, climate hazard, those that's interacting with exposed kind of systems, human or ecological systems, and then the extent of vulnerability of that exposed system, which results climate risk. And then whatever action you do as adaptation will try to kind of help you to build resilience and capacity so that you will minimize the impact of climate. So just trying to understand the conceptual understanding. The next slide, please. Then we'll see here the recent report, actually it's supposed to be AR6, sorry for that one. I'm just capturing some information for Africa, for example, like, so the mean annual temperature for Africa would rise. That means like we are anticipating more warming in the Africa continent generally. The ecosystems are already being affected by climate change, and the future impacts are expected to be substantial. So this is a statement from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the recent one. Then climate change will amplify existing stress on water availability in Africa. So I think that's a very clear message. That's future challenge for water security in Africa. So we have to be actually very serious in terms of how we are managing our resources as we do our development, socioeconomic development in Africa. Then the climate change is a multiplier of existing health vulnerabilities. I think, thank you, Rohini, also for mentioning the pandemic. And then this is also through insufficient access to safe water and improved sanitation. So you can see actually already most of the impacts of climate change are felt through its impact on water. There are some reports for sub-regions in Africa. Probably I'm not going into the detail, but for North Africa, for example, the impact of climate change is reported to be reduction in precipitation or rainfall. And then it's expected that in future, about 22% of the shortage is anticipated. Eastern Africa, reduced flow in one of critical rivers like Blue Nile, impact on groundwater recharge. And then Southern Africa, you can see reduction in precipitation, rainfall, decrease in water availability in the Zambezi, Key River Basin, Okavango, the important ecological system, the Delta, impact on groundwater recharge. Central Africa, it's because the Congo system, they reported it could be a bit less impact. West Africa, there's rainfall variability in the Volta Basin, reduction runoff in some of them. So it shows that the impact of climate change is actually affecting the water resources that we have. So in the future, water security will be very much challenged because of climate change. Next slide, please. So the next slide will show you what's already the impact, already damage level by climate change. I'm just taking only flood and drought cases in Africa. So if I start from Eastern Africa region, I think the severe drought back in 2011, 2012 was very, very serious. Actually, that was the worst drought in 6 years in the Eastern Africa, what happened in 2020, 11 and 12. And the flood risks, the recent one in 2019 in Mozambique and also Zimbabwe, that was actually a very big damage caused due to flood in the Southern Africa region. Then North Africa flood in Algeria, for example. But very interesting is Lake Chad. If you see Lake Chad, the size of Lake Chad is actually, it's like we call it vanishing lake, which has receded already out of 20 after 24,000 kilometers square to 2,000 kilometers square in just 40 years. It's very scary actually, which is actually affecting the whole life support system for about 30 million people in the case of Lake Chad. So that's really very scary kind of situation. But there are also overall kind of common for Africa challenges: change in rainfall, variability in the distribution, the drying up of rivers, depleting groundwater, and degraded ecosystems such as wetlands. So it's certainly a very serious challenge that climate change is actually posing, particularly for water resource management and for water security overall. Next slide, please. So that's actually in terms of appreciating the challenge we have. So in terms of summary, we can say like water is like both hazard because it's because of drought and floods and so on, but it's also one of the key means for us to adapt to climate change. So the African Development Bank actually carried out a kind of a quick analysis on the adaptation component of the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, in Africa in 2019. And then they actually identified water to be prioritized as one of the most vulnerable sectors in Africa, actually. So you can see the graph, actually 27 countries reported or actually prioritize water as one of the key priority sectors that's already vulnerable to climate change. So the graph on the right side is, on the right-hand side is actually more global assessment, trying to assess adaptation component of, again, NDCs, national determined contributions in 2020. And 79% of the countries actually prioritized fresh water for adaptation. So you can see how important water is actually as part of your intervention, trying to build resilience as an adaptation kind of means. So you can understand, like, it can be a challenge when it comes to hazard or flood or drought, but it can be a means also to adapt for adaptation, because water resource management is actually key as part of climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. Then so what are people like? I think Rohini already mentioned about people doing on the national adaptation planning process as part of commitment to the Paris Agreement. And very important is there are different programs, partnerships, networks that are providing support to different countries. The National Adaptation Plan guidelines, that's UNFCCC, and then there is also what we call it a water chapter, will help actually countries to, in terms of providing technical guidance. How do you integrate water when you do your national adaptation planning? So I think if you go to online, you will find this technical guideline which can help you. How do you integrate water as you do the national adaptation plan? I will not go into the details, but you can find it online. I can also share the link on the chat, in the chat box. Next slide, please. I would like to move to the next one. There is the guideline document, National Adaptation Planning, but this one is just a summarized version of it. Where do you start? You do the adaptation planning, and then you do the resource mobilization aspect for action, and then you do the implementation, taking actual adaptation actions, and there is monitoring and evaluation, trying to see the effectiveness of your adaptation action. Then you learn from what you did, learning, and then you revise your plan, and then you go to another adaptation planning cycle. So that's basically a normal process as you do any other intervention, but we just want to see how NAP is also linked to the overall process of development. Next slide, please. So then this slide will show you how do you integrate adaptation with the budget process, for example. So the inner part is the adaptation planning process. The outer part is the overall national development planning and budget processes. So this one shows you how important is you have to link to the national adaptation planning to the overall national development plan and the budget processes. So it will be like a national level development plan and budget allocation process, where you talk about the national adaptation planning process. And then when the countries are moving to developing their sectoral plans and budget processes, then we are talking about the sectoral adaptation planning and also guidance process, so that you can actually influence. So when agriculture sector is doing agriculture sector planning process, you can actually make sure the climate change adaptation is part of that sectoral planning process. The same thing as you go to the lower levels, subnational levels, district is similar process, but the tools could be different probably. You may provide some more closer technical assistance or a kind of checklist process as you go down to the specific adaptation planning process. Again, I don't want to go into the details, but the important thing is it's always important to integrate the national adaptation planning process with the national development planning and planning process and development planning process. Next slide, please. Now I will be trying to move to the case in Zambia with that kind of background, for example. So the Zambian NAP we are sharing because we found it is more of a comprehensive kind of approach, trying to link to the overall development process in Zambia. So it actually makes reference to the Vision 2030 for Zambia, which is Zambia is expected to be like a prosperous country, climate resilient, and also building a green economy by 2030. And then the whole goal is for NAP is actually climate change variability to be reduced, adaptive capacity built for Zambia, resilience will be improved in Zambia's economic systems, livelihood systems, and ecological systems. That's very important actually. That's why Zambia is trying to consider a very comprehensive approach to build resilience of the economy, the ecosystem, and all livelihood systems as well. So it has like 5 components, the overall adaptation planning process in Zambia. The first one is strengthening the institutional coordination, collaboration for adaptation planning. Very interesting is Zambia had already a climate change coordination structure, bringing different sectors together. So this is an attempt to strengthen the existing national coordination system with particular focus on climate change adaptation. So that's one area that Zambia has tried to do, improving overall coordination for climate change, but particularly also for climate change adaptation. The second area is the actual planning, but basically at a higher level, at strategic level. So Zambia is considering is creating a kind of a system to create for integrating climate change adaptation into plans and budget process. That's in terms of long-term planning and budgeting process. So there's some exercise already going on, particularly now Zambia is doing the ACE National Development Plan. This is a 5th-year development plan for Zambia, where we are trying to integrate climate change adaptation in the national development planning process, a 5-year development planning process. So they are developing a number of guidelines and tools to support that process. The third area is for kind of actual adaptation action, where you have to prioritize adaptation actions for different sectors, but also different geographical areas. There's also ecosystems, hydrological systems, but also key sectors as well. So that's another process trying to push for actual adaptation action. There's a lot of study going on in terms of climate risk analysis, vulnerability analysis, identification of adaptation options, screening them, prioritizing them, and then developing to adaptation actions for actual implementation. Then the first one, once you have the planning and prioritized actions, then you have to do, as you go to the implementation process, you have to build your capacity. And then number 4 is actually building, strengthening capacity for climate change action. Then the last one, the 5th one is resources for implementation. So the strategy for mobilizing resource. I think we have to make note, take note that we are talking about resource mobilization, not only financial, but also other resources. It can be human, technical capacity support, knowledge, and information systems. That's like overall how NAP is actually coordinated, the NAP development process coordinated in Zambia. Next slide, please. Then I just want to share with you, there are phased approach for the national adaptation planning process in Zambia. So the first phase I already described is the overarching overall national adaptation planning, which provides you a framework, this overall framework planning. And then Zambia wanted to do more focused, sector-focused planning in second phase of the planning process. So phase 2 will be like a water NAP focused. So that means Zambia actually recognized water as a connector, which is essential to all sectors, because this water is for energy, for agriculture, for anything actually, for industry and so on. So the water NAP will serve as an important pathway for building resilience and strengthening synergy with water sensitive sectors and that are for agriculture, like health, environment, and so on kind of. So that's a kind of approach. So we have the overall framework, and the phase 2 will be doing the actual detailed kind of adaptation planning for action for water sector. Next slide, please. So this is in terms of how the process is integrated, coordinated. The NAP coordination process, the NAP formulation process is coordinated as part of Zambia's climate change institutional arrangement. Actually, we didn't want to create a different process to lead the national adaptation planning process, formulation process in Zambia, but we anchored it as part of the overall climate change coordination process. So the overall climate change coordination process, it is a highly owned process. There is the Council of Ministers, which is actually chaired by the Vice President of the country. And then the National Development Planning Ministry is a secretariat for that high level kind of the Council of Ministers. So anything discussed on climate change adaptation, it's actually at that level. Then there is what we call it the steering committee, also climate change steering committee, which is composed of the permanent secretaries of the key sectors in Zanzibar, and then in Zambia. Then the secretary is the permanent secretary for Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources. Now it's like Ministry of Environment and Green Economy, according to the new cabinet. So that's actually the key. This actually is a climate change focal point in terms of Zambia. So it's the secretariat for the steering committee, but the steering committee is chaired by the Ministry of National Development Planning, which is a higher body which deals with overall planning process, which is very good actually in terms of connecting climate change adaptation with development planning, overall development planning. And then below that is the technical aspect of it. There's a technical committee being chaired by the permanent secretary for the Ministry of Environment and Green Economy. And then we have a climate change department which overall coordinating and serving as secretariat for the technical committee. Just to show you how climate change overall and climate change adaptation process is linked to the existing structure. And then how it's linked to the national development planning process, I think I already mentioned now. This 7th national development planning is already under implementation, but now Zambia is also developing its 8th national development planning where climate change adaptation is actually being integrated. Next slide, please. So what we have learned so far from Zambia, I think the first thing is ownership of the NAP process by government. I think that's very critical. If government's owning properly, it's anchored at high political level, linked to the national development planning process. And then there is a link to the climate change focal point, and the national the designated authority for GCF, for example, but also Ministry of Water is also involved as part of that process. So I think that ownership by government is very, very critical. Ownership means it's not only just supporting the process, but they are part and parcel of the whole planning process. As I say, the second one is anchoring the NAP process with a high level national process. I think I already mentioned the national development planning process was very useful for the case of Zambia. The third lesson is the comprehensive planning approach, because recognizing climate resilience as a long-term plan, but also you prioritize adaptation actions for actions in the medium term. Integrating financing strategy, resource mobilization strategy. Another important element of the NAP Zambia is gender issue is also integrated. The Ministry of Gender is also part of the climate change coordination structure. First one is NAP coordination structure within the national climate change. I think I already mentioned that you don't have to create a different structure for the NAP formulation process, but rather you build and link it to the existing national system of coordination. The multi-stakeholder participatory process, I think that's obvious. It requires the participation from different stakeholders, different actors. And the last one is the collaboration between Zambian government and other partners, actually, that can mobilize technical, financial, and other supports is very important. So actually, Zambia is kind of exemplary where the financing partner, the implementing partner, and government collaborated for the development of national adaptation planning in Zambia. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much, colleagues, for listening. Back to you, Jose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kidane. That was a super interesting presentation, and I would say that also very well constructed, because you have taken us through this journey of better understanding the different components of risk we've seen with the hazards, the exposure, the vulnerability. You have made the case for specific impacts of climate change in the Africa continent, right? And you have also shown how, particularly in the African continent, up to 27 countries are already finding that water is the most vulnerable sector. You have shared with us some of the guideline documents to help the formulation of adaptation plans. And I think you've made a strong, you have highlighted how the adaptation planning formulation needs to be linked to the overall development, national development planning, and budgeting. I think this triangulation is key, right? Adaptation planning, development planning, and the overall budgeting. So importantly, adaptation planning priorities are not left alone from ministries of finances, and the funding is available for those. You have then transitioned into this very super interesting case study that I think is really an example on how the countries can go about with the formulation of you have called it the overall NAP framework, right? The overall National Adaptation Plan framework, and how on a second phase you have explained how water is a connector. You have mentioned that water is a connector, and therefore the phase 2 in Zambia to develop a specific national adaptation plan for the water sector that connects agriculture, that connects water supply, that connects all the different elements of sustainable development. So that was great. And then you finalized with these concluding remarks that I think were also wonderful. So thanks again, Kidane, for this presentation. We will, Mario, we can have please the next slide. I will walk you colleagues over the next few minutes of this session to talk about a specific framework and tool that the Global Water Partnership, in collaboration with UNICEF, has made available in terms of all these things that we are explaining today. How does that apply to the specific water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector? What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to copy on the chat box for you to see later the link to our joint website, where we have many of the things that I'm going to be walking you through now. You will find them there. Indeed, you will find colleague Kidane and myself. We have some short video clips on that website, but that's not the most important thing. Obviously, the most important thing is that you're going to find several tools available there. I'm going to try to slow down a little bit so that interpretation it's easier. Apologies if I go too fast in some cases. The next slide, please, Mario. So what you see here is the cover of the strategic framework for water supply, sanitation, and hygiene, right? This is the document that you will find on this link that we have shared with you on the chat box. And some of this framework, which we must say is available in different languages, including English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. This framework has three key objectives, and the first one is to mitigate the impacts of climate change and the related shocks on poor people. So this can be achieved through planning and programming that seek to both, on one hand, understand what are the determinants of climate risk, exposure to services for water supply, sanitation, and hygiene, and then to act on those so that we minimize the exposure of the poorest communities and the most vulnerable communities to these climate shocks and hazards. This is the first objective. The second one is to strengthen the reliability of water, sanitation, and hygiene services. And here a starting point is the prioritization or of what we call the no regret options. Those are options that, regardless of climate change, they will still be cost effective and will make sense. And then the third objective that we aim with this framework is to strengthening capacities of governments and communities to understand and overcome the climate risk. The next slide, please, Mario. Here, what we see is the very basic structure of the framework. So, as you see, there are four distinct areas of work of this framework. In blue, the first one, we have understanding the problem. Understanding the problem means nothing else than understanding who are the stakeholders that we need to partner with. What is the capacity? what are the national adaptation plans and the climate planning documents telling us already about water sanitation and hygiene? And importantly, understanding the problem means understanding risk and developing risk assessments for water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. Here, as you can see in the figure, we have a specific guidance note that proposes a participatory approach and methodology for risk assessments in the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector. And I'm going to speak of a Bolivia case study in a couple of minutes. The second part of this framework is on identifying and appraising options. And here we also have two technical guidelines that help with this process of linking risk. Once we have understood the risk, obviously the next step is identifying what are the options for the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector, right, that can help us overcome exposure and overcome the risk in general. As we understand that we may come up with a long list of potential options to address risk, we also have a technical brief that helps with appraising and prioritizing options to, through the lens of climate resilience, narrow down and then see which one of the potential cocktail of solutions, what are the ones that for our national or local context make more sense. Then the third part of this framework is on delivering solutions. Again, here we have two technical briefs that support the implementation of this part of the framework. As Kidane was already mentioning before, importantly, with the integration, the cross integration. So we want to see water in climate planning, but obviously in water planning and water sanitation and hygiene planning, we want to see climate and climate resilience well integrated. So we propose a simple methodology to get this done. And we have other technical briefs on local participatory approaches to integrate climate resilience into water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. And finally, the fourth part of the quadrant is on monitoring and moving forward. Here we are conscious of the difficulties for monitoring climate resilience, but we do have a technical brief that comes with a lot of generic indicators that you can use as an example to try and develop your own monitoring systems. The next slide, please, Mario. So just briefly to go over these four areas of work of this framework. As we said, understanding the problem means first understanding and reviewing the existing strategies in the country. Some of the less developed countries did the work of developing national adaptation plans of actions that are all available to us, and we can see how in this specific case we're looking through the lens of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. How is this integrated into the national adaptation programs of action? Obviously, the newer version that we are focusing the attention today of developing national adaptation plans, some countries have already gone ahead, and it's important to see what those national adaptation plans already reflect on. We also have national communications to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there are other national and subnational strategies that we need to review to try to understand what is the problem. Then, as a second phase, it's important to engage with the right stakeholders, and from the water sector to break a little bit the silos and start thinking also how meteorological departments and other stakeholders can help us working together to understand the risk to the water sector. And finally, developing these assessments, identifying, as Kidane was mentioning, hazards, vulnerabilities, exposure, and also capacities. The next slide, please, Mari. So the second phase of the framework, as we've seen, is identifying and appraising options. Here, you remember I was mentioning that once we understand the risk to the water sector, the water sanitation and hygiene sector as well, we need to come up with a set of solutions, right, to address the identified risk. So here, what our framework proposes is a simplified results framework that is a generic one that can be adapted to the local and national context. And what I want to show here is a comprehensive results framework. And what we saw on the screen is just the heading, so that you can see that the framework, which is nothing else than a theory of change that you can tailor to your country needs, is divided into 3 key areas, which is what needs to happen at the national level, at the enabling environment level first. Then second, what needs to happen within the country at subnational or watershed level, how the water resources need to be monitored and managed considering climate risk. And finally, the third block of our theory of change or simplified results framework has a focus on the local and the project level. On one side, on the infrastructure and the services for water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. So the access and the infrastructure, the services, and also on the behavioral change and the governance needed at the community and local level. And then, as I said, we have some tools to help going from a long list of options to apply a climate lens and then narrow down into a set of more concrete and localized, tailored options that make sense at your national and subnational and local level. The next slide, please, Marie. We've seen that the third part of the framework is on delivering solutions, right? So once we have identified the risk, we understand the problem, we have identified and appraised options for climate resilient water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. What obviously comes next is the implementation of the solutions, right? Our framework proposes the first thing to integrate whatever it has been prioritized into the sectoral water supply, sanitation, and hygiene development plans. This is what Kidane was emphasizing before on linking the climate planning and adaptation planning with sectoral planning, right? It's very important to make this connection and this bridging. Then as a second phase, obviously, it comes with the implementation of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene climate resilient programs and projects. And we understand that as part of this and delivering solutions, a key component is capacity development. We understand that building capacity around how to integrate climate risk and climate resilience into the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector is not is necessary. So we need to build the capacity because it's not immediate, you know, on how to conduct the risk assessment, on how to appraise the right options, what are the options as we have seen at national, subnational, and local level. So we need to be working on building this capacity. And finally, as part of delivering solutions, we also come back to what Kidane was mentioning as well as budgeting and finding the resources to implement the options that we have prioritized, that we have identified as priorities for addressing the climate risk in water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. The next slide, please. And then we've seen that the final part of the framework goes about monitoring and moving forward. Here we have explained to you that we have a technical brief that explains and proposes some indicators, right, that you can use to embed in your existing monitoring systems. We wouldn't like to see parallel monitoring systems for monitoring climate resilience in the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector. What we would like to see is how specific indicators are added to existing monitoring platforms and systems at the national and subnational levels. If we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So in this slide, what we wanted to do is to first So this this NAP formulation generic flow chart. This is taken from one of the technical guides that Kidane has shown before. This is what it's a regular generic National Adaptation Plan formulation process that goes from launching the process, identifying gaps, capacity gaps, and the development needs and the climate vulnerabilities. It goes into this circle that we are going to focus now a little bit more on, developing what is the core of the National Adaptation Plan, to then go into what we were explaining of integration into sectoral strategies, and then monitoring and reviewing. But if we do the next click, I will ask my colleagues just to do one click, because we want to focus slightly the attention into this part of National Adaptation Plan formulation. So just to make the case and for you to see how well the strategic framework that we have just presented and these 4 areas of work that we have gone through fit so well what is the formulation of a National Adaptation Plan. You see on the screen that the generic formulation of an adaptation plan starts with analyzing climate risk, right? Which is what we've been talking about understanding the risk, particularly in the wash sector, right? If we do one click, Mario, we will see that we have, we have these technical briefs that help precisely on analyzing climate risk for the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector. When we move into this area, which is identifying and appraising adaptation options, you see that this coincides completely with the second area of work of the strategic framework that we have presented, and the 2 technical briefs that we were mentioning there. Perhaps you cannot see, it's too small, but those are 2 technical briefs that can help during the formulation of a National Adaptation Plan to see through the lens of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene to identify what are the best options. You see that the circle moves into compiling and communicating adaptation plans, and it moves into integrating climate change into sectoral planning, for which the strategic framework that we have presented has another technical brief that can help you doing that, to integrate climate resilience and the priorities that have been identified into sectoral water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. The next slide, please. So just quickly to show you, we don't need to spend much time on this, just to emphasize that there is this technical brief available that it covers risk assessments for water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. It's built on the same idea that Kidane has already shown before, on the hazard, the exposure, the vulnerability, and also capacity. Just emphasizing that if we raise the capacity, we reduce the risk, while exposure and vulnerability increasing directly increase risk, as you can imagine, as you can see, if we use the risk equation that you have on the screen. The next slide, please. This is just to show how this tool works, which is basically, I will explain very simply for you to understand. It does the risk assessment. First, it focuses on the hazards, then it focuses on the exposure of who and what it is exposed to the different hazards that we have identified. And finally, it helps with making a vulnerability analysis, for which generic questions are already available and that you can implement and use in your respective countries clearly. The next slide, please. This is a slide that I have borrowed from the case study in Bolivia. In Bolivia, UNICEF, also working with the Stockholm International Water Institute as a support partner, has made use of this Global Water Partnership and UNICEF tool, and a risk assessment has been recently conducted there in Bolivia. What I wanted you to see in this slide is the different stakeholders and organizations, up to 14 plus the government, that came together as a task force to, in a participatory way, implement and use this tool that we have just shown you. We have the next slide. I'm just going to show you a couple of snapshots of actual slides that have been used during this participatory approach and process, so that the 14 plus partners agree on what are the key hazards in Bolivia, characterize the different hazards. 7 hazards were identified in relation to climate change and environmental sustainability, including floods, as we can see on the screen. And these are some of the notes that that this task force was using. It's been during the pandemic, COVID times, so everything has been done virtually. These organizations were meeting virtually, and therefore the slides were used to agree among partners. What you see is the characterization of floods in the context of Bolivia, and also a scoring system that they developed to see how floods in Bolivia are a key hazard in the present day, but also in the expected future, based on what the climate models are saying. And based on that, they develop a classification system, making use of the tool that we have presented, to come up with a final scoring, in this case, the maximum score of 3 points for floods. As I said, this task force identified 7 hazards as key hazards for the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector. The next slide, please. This is just a compilation of, for floods, you know, the different information already available and maps of the country, giving different information or in relation to floods. I just wanted to show this as an example of how part of the process is compiling existing information and graphical information and maps about the hazards. The next slide. This one obviously is not intended for you to read, is not the idea, but just want to illustrate the complexity at the end of this complexity. We create, making use of the risk assessment tool. There is an Excel tool available that helps you with compiling the different hazards. It is structured in these color columns that you see, the hazards on the left, the different levels of exposure in the middle, in green, the vulnerability, and then the final score based on the different scoring for hazards, exposure, and vulnerabilities. I just want, you see it's very small. This Excel file has 200 lines for the different levels of hazard and the splits into the 7 hazards that were prioritized, all the different levels of exposure, and all the different levels of vulnerability. What you see on the screen is just a little segment of 200 lines Excel that the tool that we have available help you organize, as you can see on the right side in red, more red and yellow. It helps you prioritize, and it gives you the prioritized risk. What we can see in the next slide, indeed, is a little bit more of a summary of what come out of this matrix. Still very small letters, but for you to see on the left the hazards, we have 6 hazards were prioritized: the forest glacier retreat, floods. As I said, it's not just climate, but also environmental sustainability with pollution from agriculture, also droughts and mining pollution. The different levels of in the middle of exposure that were highlighted and came up of the aggregated risk. And very small, it's not intended for you to read, but you can see the different components of vulnerability and key things that came up out of this vulnerability analysis. Next one. That's it. I will leave it here. I hope that you found this interesting. We have gone through the strategic framework for climate resilient water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. You have the link in the chat box. We have focused on how Bolivia has made use of the risk analysis, and this is what we have just finalized now. What I would like to do now is to move into the next segment of our session, as we are approaching the last 25 minutes. And here, what we have for you is we're going to invite our colleague Ben Larroquette, who is Regional Technical Advisor covering Africa, but at the moment also covering Asia. And Ben is going to walk us through an interesting case study as well, sharing experiences on integrating water issues into NAPs with, I believe, Ben is going to be the Togo case study. So I hand over to you, Ben, for the next few minutes. Thank you.
Jose. Thank you very much. And of course, my intervention is not as fancy and detailed as Jose just did. I don't have a presentation. I'm just going to tell you a story. And the story is about designing a proposal on wash and access to water in Togo. And this is aimed at financing from what we call the vertical funds. So basically the Green Climate Fund, the GCF or the GEF. But in this case, we're looking for financing at the GCF. So like Jose said in his presentation, the starting point when we want to design a proposal in a country is to look at the climate risks and the climate impacts. And this is really important because this is really what kind of defines and designs the project slowly based on the conclusions. So as we understand that, you know, climate change brings in increased variability in rainfall, increased intensity in extreme weather events like floods and droughts, etc., we need to understand and analyze the impacts and the risks that this change is bringing to the local communities. And this is something, excuse me, this is something that's important, and the analysis of this data is what we call the climate rationale. And it's basically looking at as much data as possible going back in the future, 20, 30, 40 years of hydromet data to understand the trends of climate change, what are the risks, what are the impacts on the specific sector that we're talking about, in this case, water. And this is important because the vertical funds, as we call them, or the Green Climate Fund, only funds the impacts of climate change. It doesn't fund the baseline. So in this case, for example, access to drinking water should be there, should happen with or without climate change. That is something that is considered baseline. Everybody should have access to drinking water or sanitation, etc. But climate change, we can see, makes this complicated or more complicated than it used to. So for example, if you have a well in a community in northern Togo, in the Sahel, in the Savannah or Kara region, we can analyze and understand that the well is reducing in its output capacity or even drying up completely, and this is linked to climate change. So we need to make this link to show that climate change with its increased droughts and reduced rainfall has created this problem that the well of this community has dried up or is not giving sufficient water. And the solution is to dig a deeper well and probably replace the pump with a more efficient one and replace the diesel pump with a solar system, etc., etc. And this GCF will pay for, because we have demonstrated in our logic that the reason why this well has dried up is very closely connected to climate change. But for example, if you want to create a new well or new access to water that is not really justified because of the impacts of climate change, it'll be more difficult to get funding because this will be considered baseline. So anyway, once we have identified these problems and the impacts of climate change on access to water, what are the solutions? And the solutions we look at are mostly from two angles. One is water capture and one is water access. So basically, in terms of jargon, it kind of translates into one aspect being what we call IWRM, which is integrated water resource management, and the other being WASH, what we have been discussing right now. And IWRM is really important because it's the part of the proposal that will focus on capturing the water, on improving the ability for the communities to actually catch the water when it falls. And this has to do with watershed level work, where we do a lot of restoration work, reforestation work, bunding, ponds and damming, etc. All very small scale, of course, community level scale. But this restoration work at the watershed level allows for the water that comes during the rainy season, or even with climate change, sometimes at intervals that are not expected, to be captured, to get into the ground and recharge the aquifers, so that later water access, when we're developing access to water for the communities in terms of drinking water, but also water for irrigation, because it's very important to support them with their resilient agriculture, which is subsistence for them and livelihood. So when we use this water, we have in our system a way of capturing more water, and we can actually calculate these balances and make sure that the increased consumption or the better access to water that the project is delivering is also compensated by better catchment, better capture and recharge. And of course, at the center of all this lies the community. And the community is so crucial and central to any project. And we know this because for decades, it hasn't been so clear, but we focus our project on the community, on building community-based organization, on focusing on gender issues at the community level to manage these new water infrastructure and designs that are being implemented there. Because we know from experience that if we don't involve the community, if we don't build the capacity of the community to manage by themselves these new infrastructure, most of the time the sustainability of the project is affected. It doesn't work as well. And oftentimes the infrastructure is actually non-functional after a while, et cetera, et cetera. So this sequencing is really important, where we are going from an analysis of the climate risk to an understanding of what might be the best preferred solution, and then involving the community from the start at the design phase. And this is crucial. We have very intense and large scale consultations when we design GCF proposals at the community level. And this is documented and provided as an annex to the proposal to the GCF, so that we can really show that the people who are going to be directly benefiting from this project have been involved in the design and planning of the project and will be involved in the implementation, but then also the management and the sustainability of all the new infrastructure that is being developed and proposed. So this is all connected together. And there's one final piece that I wanted to kind of share with you is what we call the aspect of innovation, private sector engagement, and generally speaking, paradigm shifting. It's important that today we understand that public finance, which is what we're talking about when we talk about proposals and grants, are going to be insufficient and should be catalyzing additional financing and additional co-benefits. And to do this, we need to look into innovation. Innovation often comes through technology, but not alone. It can also be in terms of management and community-based organization innovation. It comes with the engagement and the involvement of the private sector. We need to remove the barriers that prevent the private sector from, engaging and being catalyzed into this sector. And together, private sector engagement, innovation, and sustainability bring something that's very crucial, which is paradigm shifting. We need to shift the paradigm. We need these projects to be at scale so that they can actually change the way governments and communities behave about how they adapt to the new changing climate in terms of accessing water and managing water for their communities. And with that, I was given a 10-minute slot. I think I've used it. I am very happy to take questions if we have time, or if anyone has any questions, but this is it for me, and I hand back the floor to Jose.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ben. That was very, very interesting, and definitely you didn't need any fancy presentation to make this very clear presentation. I think the sequence, again, we are re-emphasizing the same, but you have linked it to a real case study on how the application of this idea that we are putting forward here of identifying risk first, looking for what are the best solutions to identify risk, then and importantly, as you have mentioned, involving the communities that they will benefit from these interventions is also key for getting climate financing in this specific case that you have illustrated from Togo in relation to the Green Climate Fund. And finally, your final remarks on private sector engagement, which are key. So I think you have highlighted things such as the country and community ownership, the climate rationale you have started with as well, and also scale up interventions, right? To try to take it from not just one time of intervention, but to engage the right cocktail of stakeholders so that these interventions can be scaled up. So thanks very much for all that.
Yeah, and if I can add this concept of shifting, paradigm shifting, it's very important. It's linked to scale, but I think it's important to keep in mind that if we want to beat this thing that's called climate change and adapt better, we need to do things differently. And this bringing a paradigm shift is also important.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Pam. So with that, what we're going to do is we want to move into a participatory, more participatory part of this session. And what we're going to do is we are going to move into a set of questions that we have prepared for you. We're going to put the questions on the slide, and you will be able to vote and select the questions that you think are more pertinent. We have 3 questions for you. This is going to be managed through Polet.com, and our colleague Mario is going to be sharing has already shared on the chat box the way that you can use to vote. Here, the question that we are going about is how are water issues addressed in the national adaptation plans? And here you have 4 options that you can choose. I see that some of you colleagues are already voting. You can either choose for a specific section on water issues is included in the NAP, considering water issues as a cross-cutting issues. Option B, which is the different sectors of the National Adaptation Plan, well-integrated water issues as adaptation options. Option 3, which is a specific water sector, as we've seen in the case of Zambia, is developed. Or the 4th option, which is National Adaptation Plan adequately covers water-related climate hazards, such as floods and droughts. I see that the voting is moving. We're going to give it a couple of few more seconds. I see this interestingly moving up and down some of the slides. We don't see any one marking C for the moment, which is the Zambia case study that we've seen. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite our colleague Sadia, who is technical consultant for the National Adaptation Plan Global Support Program at UNDP, to perhaps comment of what you see on the screen, what is going on, and what your thoughts are, Sadia, in relation to this voting and the options that we have. Sadia, the floor is yours if you want to share some thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much, Jose, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I think those results are very interesting, and I would really much like to know from the respondents which country they are from, because it's actually quite encouraging to see that 55% of respondents have said that in their NAP they are integrating water issues in the different section of the NAP has integrated water issues. So I guess it's the water in those NAPs is a cross-cutting issue as opposed as a sectoral one. I found this quite interesting because in the NAP that we have reviewed, the NAP posted on NAP Central, the UNFCCC NAP Central, but also in countries where we are supporting NAP formulation, we have a slightly different dynamic. We also see from the results that 9% of respondents said that the NAP is covering all water-related climate hazards, so floods and droughts, for example. So this is quite a small percentage, and this one is, I guess, in line of what we have seen. But let me just unpack a little bit what we have seen and why I'm actually very encouraged with the results that what we see. What we see so far in the NAP that we have reviewed is that countries are taking a sectoral approach, and we were not surprised of that, and I think it makes sense at this stage because this is very much aligned with the administrative structure of government, and this is how government carries also its operation. What we see, however, that is water is an important aspect of the NAP in both the respondents' questions, but also responses, but also in the NAP that we have reviewed. But in the NAP that we have reviewed, we also see that while it is not seen as a cross-cutting, water comes as a priority sector, so as one of the most vulnerable sector, unsurprisingly. We also see that there have been a certain number of risk and vulnerability assessments that have been carried out with degrees of comprehensiveness in terms of the agroecological zones that had been covered, in terms of how gender dimension, for example, has been integrated, but there have been efforts to assess the risk and the vulnerability. And they have also started to identify adaptation priorities. So there are priorities that touch upon improving the policy, legal and regulatory frameworks, the institutional framework. They have also adaptation options related to climate smart water management techniques, or building new or retrofitting existing water infrastructure. So I think what we have seen and the results both place an important weight on water as being a key component of the NAP. Where I'm saying I'm very encouraged with the result is that we understand that the NAP process, it's iterative. And this NAP that are being prepared or have just been submitted are really the very first generation of the NAPs. So through the implementation of these NAPs, we hope that there will also be a strengthening of the enabling environment, so that the climate governance will also be further strengthened. We will have a more comprehensive risk and vulnerability assessment. It has been emphasized throughout the webinar that the climate rationale is very important. And what we hope also through this first generation of NAP is to see a shift to start seeing a momentum for shift from a project-based approach to some sort of more long-term approach. So we hope that the implementation of these first NAPs will actually enable that to happen. And because of that, we have hope that the second generation of NAPs, or those NAPs that are already in preparation and seems to go along this way, will be more cross-cutting in nature in terms of addressing the water aspect. So we hope that we have a more holistic approach where water will be seen as part of a nexus of climate, food, energy, health as well. So it would be really interesting to actually get feedback from the respondents on how they have gone along in having water as a cross-cutting issue in their NAP.
Thank you so much.
We can have maybe some comments on the chat about that.
Thank you, Sadia. Those were very important remarks as well. And I think for the moment, we'll leave it there with this important call that you're making, right? For the second generation of NAPs to build on something that we have discussed across this session today, which is the interconnectivities. And it's been mentioned before that water is a connector, right? I'm seeing this connectivity of the water sector coming through the next generation of NAPs. I think this is the final call that you were making, Sadia. And obviously we invite participants to make further reflections using the chat box. We have 2 more questions. I would ask my colleague Mario to exactly. So we have the second question. You can use, I believe, the same the same link that it was shared earlier to provide your thoughts about the second question, which is what kind of support you have received from partners so far in your National Adaptation Plan formulation and the implementation process. Here you have 6 options to choose from: technical assistance in preparation of proposals, training and technical assistance on how to do and formulate a NAP, sharing knowledge, experiences and tools and guidelines, supporting buy-in for NAP processes, technical assistance in developing pipeline of adaptation projects, and finally, partner for implementation adaptation interventions. While you colleagues are voting, I would invite Kidane to take the floor again to share some thoughts on what you see on these different options, Kidane, and how you see the vote moving.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you very much. I don't know, probably we may give a little bit more time maybe to see, but I can also speak what I see now. Yeah, so I think this is basically trying to see what kind of support partners are providing for the countries as part of the formulation of NAP process, but also for the implementation of adaptation actions on ground. So yeah, so the bigger support is around training, technical assistance on how to do NAP formulation process. I think that's obvious, because the focus particularly for the initial phase was actually to get NAP process done. So it looks, but now it looks like there is A and B are similar for preparation of proposals. That's very interesting, actually. We got case study from Togo, from Ben, actually, regarding the first one. So the idea is like, if you don't have that capacity to prepare proposals to access funds for NAP or any adaptation project, then you may lose the opportunity of accessing that globally available kind of funds. So that could be an important aspect for countries to consider. So preparation of proposals to access funds for the formulation of NAP, and also sharing of knowledge, experience, tools, and guides. They are actually like a similar level for now. Then adaptation intervention for implementation 10%, which shows actually for us as we conclude our national adaptation formulation process, then the next steps actually for implementation. So now it looks like this small support received for implementation. This shows that our future plan for support will be focusing around implementation of adaptation plan and also actual implementation of adaptation actions in the future. That actually tells you the right picture, I would say, because the initial focus was around planning formulation. Going forward, we'll be focusing more support for implementation of the NAP process, but also for actual adaptation action. That now it looks much better, actually.
It makes
Thank
sense.
you.
It makes
Yeah.
sense. Looks like very well ordered right in the process that you could be expecting. Thank you so much, Kidane. And we
Thank
have
you.
the last third question. We are approaching the end of this webinar. We have only remaining this third question that we're going to put on the screen for you, and we will conclude with some ending remarks in just a couple of minutes. So we can have the next question, Mari, please, when you can. Perfect. So the third question is, what is your experience in integrating climate resilience into the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector? So here options we have is that the WASP programming does not appreciate the significance of addressing climate issues as part of water service delivery, which at the moment, half of you think is being the case. So there is a lack of awareness, I could say, of the own sector. Then there is awareness created and integrating climate resilience into WASP programs is being prioritized. This is moving now, it's moving back. And then another option that we have is that climate resilience is integrated into water supply, sanitation, and hygiene at higher policy and strategic level. Climate resilience is integrated into water supply, sanitation, and hygiene initiatives at the project and program level. And the final option was that climate resilience, water supply, sanitation, and hygiene initiatives are implemented. I think here, similarly to what has happened with the question before, we see a progression. Right before we get into the implementation, we are still facing this lack of awareness of the water sector, perhaps the lack of tools, how to, which is what we're trying to break today as well. There are tools available for the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector to be used to integrate climate resilience and to address unidentified risks and to go about that. We are still in the phase that we need to make more awareness of those tools so that the water sector understands how to get this done. And then we are moving towards the implementation, which, as we can see, and similar to what happened before, implementation is still at a lower level. I wouldn't like to take much more time, but perhaps to invite for concluding remarks, as we are just exactly right now getting the 90 minutes that we have promised of this session, I would like to hand over now to Rohini. Back to you, Rohini, for some final concluding remarks. It's not the easiest job here, but just if you can share with us some few thoughts and takeaway messages. Thank you, Rohini.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are nearly out of time, but I think firstly, just to thank all the presenters and the participants. It's a very deep subject, I believe, and really deserves in-depth discussion. And I think one good thing is that we do have some knowledge products planned with the GWP team. There is a technical brief on water and resilience and a second one looking at gender. So those will be coming out. So please be rest assured the conversation doesn't end here. We'll also be having a webinar on GCF readiness late towards the end of November. And we would, of course, welcome colleagues for that as well. Now, just a few seconds of, I think, what transpired in today's conversation. So I think we got some very interesting examples, I think, starting, with the firstly, like the tool which was presented by Jose, which is on risk assessment, in the water sector. And I think he gave a very good flavor of the number of elements or factors there are, looking at both the historical, sort of data, as well as future projections and a scoring system. So I think tools such as that, and it was all done virtually, which I think was, that means that perhaps it's not, even in the pandemic world, it is possible, I think, to actually apply these kind of tools. And I think we found a number of you that actually looking at tools are interested in tools like this. So I think it's very useful. And of course, to see it in the context of Bolivia, how it was applied, was very interesting. So clearly there is, there are cost-efficient methods of doing risk assessment. And this is a very important point, because risk assessment has many methodologies and tools, and it can be done at very, very large costs, or it can also be done, with a lot of national capacity in place. So there is no one standard way there's no one standard tool for it, really. So I think by showing these demonstrated tools, it really helps us a lot. I think from Kidan's presentation, we got a very good example of how Zambia, they have integrated their work, in a way, using water as a connector, because there's a temptation to prepare a sectoral adaptation plan on water. And then, it's quite possible to prepare that and then go ahead and implement it. But I think in the case of Zambia, what we understand is using it more as a cross-sectoral connector, and which means looking at many of those issues around planning and budgeting, intersectoral coordination. I mean, I think we have to be clear, it's a very big challenge for countries to be doing this, but it's very encouraging to see some of the design of the projects. And I think what Kidan presented for Zambia is a good case of how the institutional frame setup has been put forward, what sort of framework is being used. It's still early days for some of the NAP projects, but I think it's very good for us to get the real-time information about programs like this that are happening, and we can share more examples such as that for the readiness webinar. I think the other thing I actually learned from Ben's presentation is it was not about the NAP process, but if we understand exactly what goes into designing an adaptation and investment for adaptation options, I think that the international funds use very rigorous criteria, and preparing the climate rationale is a big part of it. Domestic funds may not require that level of sophistication. But I think these are these are supposed to be transformative projects. So it's very important to see the kind of information and evidence required. And not all of it can be supplied by the NAP document, but at least halfway, the basic rationale can be applied by the NAP, which is a much more national kind of a framework. But then, and it can also provide a set of adaptation options. But finally, drilling down into one program or one investment idea requires a granular level of information, which is not very easy, but it's important for us to understand these two levels. I mean, the countries need an overarching adaptation framework. Otherwise, they'll just have one or two projects here or there. They need to scale up the investment. So the reason for the NAP is to provide at least some of that prioritization, even though we know it cannot go into one project necessarily. For that, you need much deeper level of information to convince investors. But both are well connected. And I think finally, somehow the bottom up and the top down has to really, I think that message is coming out strongly again from Kedan's presentation, that this could be very well a national adaptation plan, but at the subnational level, if there's no monitoring happening at the provincial level and at the local level, if there are no simplified frameworks, that's where implementation happens. I mean, there has to be those three levels, and it does not have to be a perfect document or a perfect planning process, but there has to be adaptation action on the ground. And that is why the understanding of what is happening with local actors is extremely important, and empowering those local actors is really important, and it needs to happen much more. We're not very sure to what extent is happening yet through the NAP process, because the main I would say issue now is formulation, but also implementation. And if a country doesn't have a NAP, it still has to continue to implement adaptation and scale them up. And if it has a NAP, it needs to use it for the implementation. So these things have to go hand in hand and not sequentially, not wait for one or the other. So there's a lot that actually came out. This is not a summary, but this is what actually came out to me in this conversation. And I think at this stage, we will probably put up a web page and PDF some of the presentations, since a lot of you are asking for them. And we look forward to, I really want to thank the GWP team for really bringing this together so well. It's a very deep subject and difficult to cover in 90 minutes. But the fact that we have kept most of our audience, I see everyone has stayed, I think is really testament to how well this has gone. So really thank you to all the participants, to Sadia, and to all the GWP team for putting this together, and hope to see you at least once more after the COP takes place. So thank you everyone, and hopefully see you next time.
Thank you, Rohini. We will, with those closing remarks, we are going to finalize this session. Just to say also that behind the scenes, there are colleagues that have been working also to make this session possible. A special thanks to Anjali Lohani, also a colleague in GWP, Mario Lamban, who has been helping us with all the logistics to make sure that everything goes well today. Thank you very much to all of you, and also from partner organizations that have been made this possible. I think with this, Rohini, we are closing the session, right? Thanks again to all the panelists, and thank you importantly to all of you for participating, and as Rohini just said, for staying till the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you for Jose. Excellent moderation. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Rohini, Sadia. Thank you, everyone.